Okay, welcome everybody from literally all over the world. And this is an amazing opportunity for me to share some thoughts about the emotional aspects of the Alexander technique without having to fly and without you guys having to fly. This is really quite a strange time, but it does open up opportunities. I can't imagine another opportunity of being able to share my thoughts with people literally from all over the world, from Japan to California to, I'm not sure about Australia, but maybe Australia, Europe, and some of the Far East. And here we are in this rather strange Zoom experience. And I wanted to share maybe just a little bit about my own biography to set the stage for what we're going to do today. I had quite a turbulent teenage years, and I was always looking for something to make me feel better in the world. And 13, 14, 15, 16, I started exploring different systems, meditation systems, psychological systems. I checked out Eastern mysticism. And in my late teens, I even checked out psychedelics. It was, of course, the 70s. And I went to study psychology at university for my first degree. The reason I studied psychology, it really wasn't because I wanted to help everybody, although that was probably my narrative at the time. The real reason I wanted to study psychology was to understand myself, to sort something out within my own soul. 3 years later, I hadn't quite sorted out things within my own soul. I was still quite a turbulent young man in my 20s. I went to live in Israel on a kibbutz for a couple of years, learned Hebrew, went to university to do a master's in mass media and communications. And I came across a wonderful book called The Alexander Principle by Dr. Barlow. I went back to London and I thought, I have to check this guy out. I called up Dr. Barlow in London and he said, "Young man, come along for a lesson," which I was very happy to do. It was 1979. And he gave me a first lesson and then passed me on to my first Alexander teacher. And that was the beginning of my Alexander journey. What struck me in the book, The Alexander Principle, was the idea of psychophysical unity, the idea that the body and the mind are intimately connected. And I thought this may be a version, a therapeutic version that could help me, to help me feel better in the world. And I thought that Alexander lessons would help me feel better in the world. I don't know if it's familiar at all to you guys, but I really did think at the beginning of my Alexander lessons that if I directed well enough, if I could only improve my blasted primary control, I would feel great. I would feel great all the time. And that was one of my motivations for learning the Alexander technique. Yes, I did have my back problems. I checked out osteopathy. But I was really looking for peace, for answers, to feel better within myself. And I really thought that if I could direct well enough, I would achieve my goal. That was my main motivation. Didn't quite work out like that. And over the years, I've been through psychoanalysis, lying on a couch 3 days a week for 10 years. And I'm still unsorted. I've done my Alexander training. I thought that would be an answer, and I'm still unsorted. But I've learned a few things along the way. that I wanted to share with you, things that relate to the Alexander technique and things that I think are very relevant for Alexander teaching, for Alexander teachers who see the Alexander technique not simply as a postural re-education, but a possibility for emotional healing. And there have been some changes along the way for me, but maybe it's important that you all understand, at least from me, that after, let me think, 35, nearly 40 years of Alexander exploration, the journey is not over, and there's plenty of unfinished business. And I struggle. Alexander teachers struggle. I think sometimes you go to an Alexander teacher and you see them very peaceful and calm and happy, and you think, gosh, I want some of that. That's how I want to be. But you don't see the other side of your Alexander teacher. You don't see their rubbish days, their low days, their upset days. You see them in a controlled environment where they're the ones very much in the controlling seat, and you come for help. But maybe it's important right now just to puncture that often delusion, that Alexander teachers have it all sorted and have it all worked out, because we don't. And actually, I don't really think Alexander, the technique of Alexander, is about feeling good all the time. I think that's another illusion. What is it all about? In a nutshell, I think the Alexander technique is much more about having experience, being able to tolerate feelings, emotions, and struggles without losing touch with reason. That's an Alexander term. He said the technique was a way of learning and growing in the ability not to lose touch with reason. For Alexander himself, it was very much centered around what he called emotional gusts, where he'd fly into blind rages when he was upset with someone maltreating a horse or other animals. He had a very big temper, apparently, when he was a young man, and he felt that was a poor way of functioning. And he felt that along his journey of discovery, what he was more able to maintain as he grew older was to stay in touch with reason. And that doesn't mean staying in touch with some cognitive part of the brain, some disembodied part of the brain. What I think he meant was the ability to hold and contain and experience emotional states without flipping out, without losing touch with oneself, being able to stay back from the drama, but not avoid it, not to distract with various habits and addictions. What I think he discovered was that the Alexander technique had a potential for helping
Anthony, I think somebody's muted you because it looks like you're muted. I can't hear you. I don't know whether anybody else
Yes, it muted again, Ina. Did you miss? How much did you miss? How much did you miss just now?
80 has the potential, and then we didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
Yes, good. So I'll say that again. Alexander has the potential for helping us stay with ourselves, even when our emotional feelings our experiences threaten to overwhelm us. And the technique is really a technique of helping us stay back, helping us manage, helping us tolerate the uncomfortable without freaking out and without losing touch with ourselves. It isn't a technique for transcending feelings or avoiding them. It isn't a technique to feel good all the time. It's not a picnic every day. It's not a lollipop or a bandage that makes you feel better for the short term. I feel that in essence, it's about emotional learning. Alexander talks a lot about the technique being a re-education. We call ourselves teachers and we call the people we work with pupils. But what are we really learning? What is the essence of what an Alexander pupil learns, and what do we teach? Well, of course, on one side of the spectrum, the technique can teach us about our bodies. And within our wonderful Alexander umbrella, we have some amazing contributions from people like Ted Diamond, who talks exquisitely about the beauty of the neck, head and back relationship, what he calls the primary control. It is exquisite. It is absolutely inspiring the way we're built. But there's often an elephant in the room with Alexander lessons. And the elephant is, what about feelings? Where do feelings come into the Alexander story? Psychophysical unity honors both aspects of the spectrum. But where do feelings really come into all of this stuff? As I said, I used to think that if I could only sort out my neck and head and back, if I could only direct myself well enough into my neck being free and my head going forward and up, my back lengthening and widening, I would feel good. But a funny thing happened along the way in my Alexander work. The more I was able to sustain my own coordination, my own freedom, my own poise, it didn't bring automatic feelings of ease and happiness. It did offer postural ease. It certainly was mechanically advantageous. And here's the big difference that I don't think we talk enough about, that mechanical advantage is not the same as psychological peace. Mechanical advantage is the most efficient way we can use our bodies. When our necks free up and our heads are nicely balanced on top of the spine, and the spine is opening and our backs are widening and we breathe more easily, clearly mechanical functioning is at a high level. But to try to get the primary control to work is putting the cart before the horse. The neck, head and back relationship can be seen as a barometer of how we're functioning, rather than something that we need to fix. And if it's a barometer, you could call it maybe body language. When someone gets upset and distressed, we see it. It's visible. There's evidence. If a person is frightened, you see the startle, or the freeze, or the avoidance. When a person's concentrating, you see the pattern. The neck, head and back relationship is a wonderful mirror to the soul. But the soul is more important than the mirror. And we often lose sight of the soul and get a little bit overly obsessed with the mirror. And we can't fix the mirror. However much we'd like to change the thing we see in front of ourselves when we're looking in the mirror, the self that we're changing, the sense that the self that we're working with is a psychophysical self. that doesn't need to be fixed. In fact, the overly ambitious attempts to fix the self cause even more trouble. And so I did discover over my last 35, 40 years of exploring Alexander that as a result of my own process, I had not less emotion, but more emotion. I was more able to sit with my struggles, my sadnesses, my hopes and dreams and my disappointments, my fears, rather than using strategies to avoid them. And as much as I wanted to not feel some of these difficult states, it became less and less possible for me to avoid them. They came up, they were available, and I was more able to sit with them. This is what I understand to be the meaning of inhibition. Inhibition isn't stop, don't feel, send directions to the neck and back and move on. Quite the opposite. Inhibition in the emotional way of understanding Alexander is the ability not to react to stimuli from within and from without, emotional stimuli, upsetting stimuli, and to be able to have them and to hold them and to embrace them without reaction. This is what I understand to be the core of the process of building up inhibition in our students and our pupils. Inhibition is a vehicle for emotional learning. And this is the learning of the Alexander technique that most interests me. Yes, it's nice to have less back pain, nice to have a better voice rather than going hoarse, nice not to have tension headaches due to concentrations and efforts. That's all good. But I'm interested in what the technique can offer me as a human being that struggles and that suffers and that has good days and bad days. And what I believe it can offer me is the ability to, as I say, sit with something, because my inhibition has grown a little bit over the years, so that I don't have to use strategies not to feel and not to experience. And so again, the learning in the Alexander technique, in a psychophysical way, is a learning of experience. Emotional learning. Emotional learning means knowing a bit more who we are before we've vanished. To know a bit more about how we experience ourselves. To know ourselves more deeply without the usual strategies of avoidance, addictions, and what Alexander called habits. I don't want to spoil the session in a few days' time when we'll be exploring habits, but it's come up now rather than in another couple of days, that the habits that Alexander talked about, the habitual reactions to stimuli, are really ways of not feeling things, of not experiencing things, of not actually being in touch with things. So that if something happens to me, if I'm feeling stage fright, for example, why do I mention stage fright? Because goodness, sitting in front of 300 people is quite a daunting experience. It's not something I do every day. And what do I do with stage fright? Well, it's not a decision I can make. I can't make a decision to inhibit all my feelings about it. Inhibition is exactly the opposite. Inhibition is actually, Anthony, this is my reality. Can I sit with it? Can I experience it? Can I have it? Can I be with stage fright and still function? More or less. I might blank every now and again. I might fluff my words every now and again, but stage fright is real. I don't think the technique is designed to override it. And so that's what I'm really left with. It reminds me of the Alexander story. We often talk about Alexander's story as a story of a reciter who lost his voice. And yet he did lose his voice, and that was the way in. But it was just a way in, it was just a door. What he discovered after walking through the door was that the technique was much more interesting than solving a little voice problem. Maybe we can reframe the Alexander story as a story about stage fright or end gaining. Maybe when he went on stage, he was so keen to impress the audience that actually he wanted to be successful. He wanted to be impressive. He wanted to inspire. Right now, of course, I want to impress and inspire. And what does it make me want to do? Well, it makes me want to reach out to you and grab you and convince you and control you. That's what I want to do. But I'm not doing that right now, or maybe not too much, which means sitting with the desire to affect, to convince, to educate, to help, to teach, and have no control in whether I succeed or not. In other words, to sit with an unknown. And I hope that rings a few bells for a few people. Alexander called his technique a way of moving from the known to the unknown, from the known to the unknown, from the known of over-control, from efforts, trying hard to be in control, to the rawness and vulnerability of not being in control. I'll give you a good example of when I first came across that as a really embodied experience, because Alexander, if it's worthwhile, it's embodied experience. It's not little ideas up here. It's certainly not anatomical knowledge. It's certainly not theoretical knowledge that you might pick up from Alexander's books. If Alexander is going to be valuable for any of us on a self level, it has to be embodied knowledge. We have to feel it, experience it here, in the heart, and in the gut, and in the soul. Carl Jung talked a lot about embodied knowledge. Once he was asked, "Do you believe in God?" And his answer was, "I don't believe. I know." And his knowing was very much from here. It wasn't some sort of belief system up here. Belief is neck upwards, it's cut off. But knowing, when you know someone, you know from here. And I think that's really important. But I'm going to give you an example of when I first came across the value of vulnerability, the value of not knowing and not being in control. Maybe someone can remind me, but I think one of the most appalling and unhelpful ways of describing the technique is about conscious control. For me, it's actually the opposite. I think the attempt to be in control is probably one of the biggest problems that we face. And I don't think Alexander meant it, by the way. I think it was an unfortunate use of terminology. But anyway, in my third year of training, I was in the middle of a rather complicated love relationship, and it wasn't going very well. And I came into class. I was in Jerusalem in my final year of training, and I had nothing to give. I was almost falling on the floor, upset, depressed, very, very raw. And certainly the Alexander training wasn't making me feel good about anything. There I was, guts all over the place. And after our day's training, every Thursday we used to meet with graduates. They used to come back to the school. And I was working with one of the graduates. And I just felt I've got absolutely nothing to give. Nothing to give at all. And I worked. And there's someone who I knew over the weeks. And she said, Anthony, what's going on with you today? So I said, what do you mean? I'm feeling really, really bad. Is that what's going on? She said, no, your work is really, really good today, really refined, very kind, and very compassionate. It's just really working well. I said, I can't believe that for a second. If you knew how I felt, then you couldn't possibly say those things. But it gave me a lot of thought for reflection, that actually when I was raw enough and I was able to stay with my rawness, the difficulty of staying with my experience, but staying with it nonetheless, without knowing anything, without having any of my usual confidence and arrogance, that I was stripped of all of that stuff. I had nothing left, no big ego. I hadn't enough energy for it. I was just raw, exposed, heart Anthony, nothing else, no intellect, no nothing. But I wasn't collapsed on the floor. And I just worked without knowing anything, without trying to get any results. There was no room, no energy left for ambition. And that's what I did. I just was Anthony, raw Anthony. And that experience taught me a huge amount. That when I teach from Anthony knows all his stuff and Anthony's been teaching a while, that's not the best Anthony. That's not the most effective Anthony. It happens. And when it comes up, it comes up. But the best Anthony is when some of that falls aside. I hope I don't have to have the most extreme, complex love relationships to get to that point. But I do understand deep in my heart and soul that I'm at my best when I have experience, when I have feelings, when I have emotions, rather than using my confidence and control to get rid of them. So for me, conscious control may be reframed that actually what we're looking for is to allow feelings and thoughts and sensations and images to come in. Allowing feelings, thoughts and sensations, feelings to come in and not control them out. Not to control them out, not to try to get rid of them, but to have them. Which brings me to the role of the Alexander teacher. What is the role of an Alexander teacher? Well, the role of a teacher is to create a safe enough space so that the pupil can experience just a little bit more okayness with who they are, that their hearts can melt, that something can open up, that they can be a bit more okay with who they are at that moment. And that's quite a rare experience for a lot of us. We haven't had that sort of contact with another human being. I think one of the most important things for an Alexander teacher to offer is, and I take this inspiration from Alexander, he said, don't excite the fear reflexes. If you excite the fear reflexes, nothing of value can take place. No learning can take place. And it's easy to excite the fear reflexes as a teacher or a trainer. I fall into that trap over and over again. I hope I realize it before too long. We can excite the fear reflexes when we ask a person to try a little bit harder. We can excite the fear reflexes when we get our pupils to feel that they're failing or that they've got to please us to maintain our acceptance. We can excite the fear reflexes when we ask a person to do something they can't achieve, like free their necks. We excite the fear reflexes when a person doesn't feel accepted just the way they are, but are encouraged to change. One of the greatest paradoxes of change is that when you try too hard to change, you end up staying the same even more. And the most powerful message you can get from your Alexander teacher is when you come through the door, that you are okay just the way you are. And that's a rather strange message for people. But what do you mean I'm okay the way I am? I've got this and I've got this pain and that pain. I'm in a mess. I want to change. You know, the industry of change, it's very oppressive. Look at my books here. Can you see them all? They're all self-help books about how to change. They haven't done me much good. They're not all self-help books. But there is such a demand to change. I'm not good enough. And what does it mean, I want to change? It really means that we're saying to ourselves, I'm not okay until I change. It actually reinforces an attitude of non-self-loving, non-kindness, and non-self-compassion. The most powerful message an Alexander teacher can offer, the most powerful message an Alexander teacher can offer is, you don't need to change. You're okay just the way you are. I accept you just the way you are. You don't have to direct. You don't have to have a better neck, head and back relationship. You don't have to try. In this room, we're going to just work together and be together. And what happens, happens. You don't have to have a feeling or a sensation or an idea or an image. You don't have to succeed in learning the Alexander technique, quite the opposite. You're in this room, whether it's a Zoom room or a tactile room, you're here in this dialogue, this relationship of teacher and pupil, where you are totally affirmed in who you are. That is the juice, that is the magic of Alexander teaching. And then feelings. The interesting thing is people say, well, what do I do with feelings? Feelings, the pupil starts to cry, the pupil feels angry, the pupil has a memory, or teachers, we're all pupils, aren't we? There's no difference. That's another myth. The myth that teachers are somehow different to pupils. And even more so, senior teachers are even more different to other teachers. It's also a load of rubbish. We're all in the same boat of humanity. There's no difference. We may have been in the boat a little bit longer or less long, but we're all in the same boat. And so the Alexander teacher, through their own self-work, and this is the issue really that I get asked a lot, and my psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has helped me understand that you can only take somebody as far as you've gone yourself. That if you want to lead somebody through the valley of death, through their own personal struggles, if you want to hold their hand while they're in pain, then you've had to have touched that part of your own soul. And I believe that instinctively, if you haven't gone along that journey, then your pupils will probably not feel that safe to open up that part of their soul. It's not a conscious decision, it's just the antennae that we have as human beings. You don't decide, I think I'll trust this person today. It goes much deeper. It's from the gut brain, from the belly brain. So the teacher works, and through the non-trying hands, or non-trying being, non-trying touch of the other being with the pupil's being, things actually happen. And they happen through undoing, but not the undoing of deep tissue massage. I want to say a few words about the difference between Alexander's learning from experience and other cathartic techniques. Alexander's not a cathartic technique. It's not about releasing emotions. Otherwise, every time you cry, that's it. That's the end of the story. Every time you have a temper tantrum, that's the end of the story. You've released it. But I think we all know emotions don't work like that. If you're having road rage or trolley rage in Tesco's or any other rage that you happen to do, when you've had that rage, it doesn't go away.
Anthony, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know, could you mute yourself again? There's a lot of interference going on. It's quite difficult to pay attention. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Is that better? Good. Okay. Yeah, where was I? I was talking about feelings. I was talking about
rage.
Rage. I was talking about Tesco's. Trolley rage. That's it. Trolley rage. So when you have this trolley rage moment or road rage moment, and you just release all this anger and stuff, that's not therapeutic. In fact, it can be exceedingly disruptive and damaging. In the early 70s and 80s, I checked out a few of these so-called cathartic techniques: Gestalt, Rolfing, deep tissue massage, expressive techniques. They were very, very popular at the time. The idea is if you feel it, better out than in, it's all gone, it's done, that's therapeutic. But many years later, about 15, 20 years later, these same techniques in the Gestalt world and in the Rolfing world realized that they were missing out on something. They were missing out on the experience being grist for the mill, the experience somehow developing the soul, growing the personality. Once you've puked it all out, once it's just spread all over the place you've cried it out, you've angered it out, you've got rid of it all, it's gone. There's no food. But and by the way, there's nothing wrong when things are overwhelming. We have pressure cookers. We let go, whether it's grief or anger. These things happen. But those releases by themselves are not therapeutic. They are not therapeutic. They may help you feel better in the moment. The real therapeutic work, which is why Alexander called his work therapeutics, the real emotional work of the Alexander experience is being able to have powerful feelings in the Alexander setting with your teacher, and to be able to hold that experience like you'd hold a baby in an embrace of compassion and care, where you have the experience and it doesn't need to change or go away, but it moves you, it informs you, it embodies you. You have the experience. And when you hold that experience like wine in a casket, it grows you. It does its emotional work. There's some processing that actually happens. There's some alchemy and transformation that happens through having experience. And if you're fortunate enough with your Alexander teacher, you'll be in a space, a safe space, where you can have feelings and experiences, where previously in your habitual world, you'd protect away from them. Keep them out of consciousness. Have tight necks and backs rather than open the experience into consciousness. Have addictions and habits that stop the experience from residing in your soul. But if you're lucky enough to be in a room with an Alexander teacher that can hold that place with you, that deep place of it's okay, I'm with you, then some of the structures of habit, the force of habit that Alexander was talking about, start to soften. And you find yourself more able to tolerate the experiences in your soul that were previously unacceptable, threatening, or overwhelming. And you start to experience older memories, sadnesses, fears, deep grief, images and memories. You know, often, especially today, people are going off into all sorts of places. They're going off into mindfulness work, they're going off into somatic experiencing, into body therapies. And what we need to understand in our work is that the Alexander technique is an amazing privilege, that we have so much to offer, that we have so much to offer in the realm of emotional healing without being psychotherapists. That it's such a shame that we are known for postural re-education so widely, and that's okay. And such a shame that it's not so clearly understood that if there is psychophysical unity, then the Alexander technique can be a vehicle for emotional integration and healing, just as much as postural ease and freedom. Ina, I think maybe it's not a bad time if there are any particular questions that are coming in that I'm happy to talk about. I also want the opportunity of maybe doing a little bit of online work, maybe tomorrow, to bring out some of these principles. I don't want to stick too rigidly to a timetable of I'm going to say this today and this tomorrow and this on Friday, but see how it works.
Yes. We have Sonja Rosen has been raising her hand.
Yes.
Would you like to unmute yourself and ask something, please?
So, thank you, by the way, for this webinar. I want to talk about tics, or I wonder if you have anything to say about them. I have, you know, for 20 plus years, had a sort of like tic in my general breast support region. And it occurred to me in the context of the Alexander technique. You know, I was having a table turn and I realized there how long I'd had this tic. And so it's like the Alexander technique helps me to learn about it. But I often feel when I'm in an Alexander learning context, like the Alexander technique or my teacher of it brings me along a path to see more and feel more my tic. And then I feel like they bring me to an edge of a cliff and then leave me there. And then there I am with like this very chaotic bouncing experience that's a sort of rising tension or upset that feels physical. And then I feel like they don't have the tools to bring me through it unless they're also certified in somatic experiencing. This has been my experience. And so my current take is like the Alexander technique only goes so far and I can only rely on it so much. And I want to get certified in something else to help my students. But do you feel like there's another way of interpreting the technique and practicing it that could encompass being helpful in this regard, etc.? Do you want to riff on this notion?
Yes, I do. I think, well, thanks very, very much for your honesty and opening up that question. I think it's very relevant to all of us, actually, all of us that have moved into this room today. Yes, there's room for traditional psychotherapy, for psychoanalysis, for somatic experiencing. as there's room for osteopathy and physiotherapy and massage. But we do ourselves a great disservice if we don't appreciate that within the psychophysical work that we're doing in Alexander, we are touching the body-soul. That this is mind-body work. It is not anatomical and physiological work, separate from the soul. The work we do does touch the deepest aspects of being. And yes, I do believe very strongly that Alexander teachers can work through this stuff without being separately trained as somatic experiencers, as psychotherapists, on one main condition, that the teacher has done their own inner work to a certain degree, that the teacher has navigated those depths of the soul themselves to a certain degree, and it's ongoing. There are so many dark corners of my soul that I haven't experienced, and I may not be able to go there. And some areas where I've done a bit more work. And I think it isn't about Alexander can or Alexander can't do something. It's how far do we as Alexander teachers want to take this? We as Alexander teachers can see this work as psychophysical, as being absolutely related to emotional integration, just as equally as anatomical ease. And if we see this journey as part of what we do in the Alexander technique, and the deeper we go into this darker valley, the more we'll be able to hold the hands of those that have all sorts of experiences, whether it's tics that may have emotional antecedents, we don't know. But it's for the teacher and pupil to hold the space together so that the pupil will feel safe enough to move over the cliff edge without any pressure, without any ambition, but when the moment is ripe. It's a bit like the dewdrop on a leaf. It doesn't choose when it drops. At a certain point, the leaf surrenders and the dewdrop or the raindrop just drops to the ground when it's ready. And our work is just the same. We don't want to be using ambition, trying to sort out the tic or the neck problem or anything else, but actually honor nature, nature's timing, biological timing. This Alexander thing is much more closely related to grace than it is technique. And grace comes onto us and into us when it's ready. We don't sort of grab it down from the sky. And I think when we're working with our pupils, it's really important not to ambition time, not to ambition biological time, but to leave healing to its own inherent time and not to rush things along, because otherwise people feel pushed when they're not ready, and that doesn't do anybody any good. And so the ambition of the teacher is really important to look at here. The teacher must really honor not knowing. I'm often informed and inspired by one of my teachers who I never met, but they're all my teachers, a guy called Bion, a psychoanalyst called Bion, who said we must aim to teach without memory, without desire, and without understanding. Without memory, without desire, and without understanding. And that's a beautiful affirmation of the Alexander technique. And so I think whatever you're working with, whatever symptom, it's not to be got rid of, but it's to be held and embraced. And if and when the time is ripe, integration may occur. And if it doesn't, that's just as good. That tics or anything else are not to be got rid of. That the attitude of getting rid of something may actually be more of the problem and accentuate endgaming, which takes us out of the Alexander field anyway. I hope that was a little bit helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I know. I'd love to be able to see the pictures of the video of people when they ask questions, if possible. I don't know how to do that technologically, but if it is possible, I'd be very happy.
It's possible, Anthony, you need to change your view into speaker view, so you go into the right upper corner.
Okay,
Okay,
good.
great.
I'll try.
Try. Yes, and now we have Athanasevetas has a hand
Hello.
up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, in response to what you've just said, I totally agree with you when you said that our work do touch the deepest aspect of our being. But then you say that, of course, there is a condition, is that everything depends on the inner work of the Alexander teacher. And of course, where is the Alexander teacher going to find the means to be able to provide then what is needed? Because yes, I agree. And then you do find some Alexander teachers who do have explored themselves enough to be able to provide this secure place, and then all that the Alexander technique can offer. But most of them, I think, or most of the ones I've met and known, they haven't done that work. And so the criticism we first heard by the lady before makes sense. So can you say anything about that?
I think there's a lot of very sensitive Alexander teachers out there, and I think we're all on the journey. I don't think it's only Alexander that develops this deepening of experience. I think sometimes life events, not necessarily pleasant ones, can be teachers. They can either break us or deepen us. And sometimes unfortunate upsets, difficult childhoods, painful experiences can also develop the soul. A student of mine shared with me that after she lost a loved one, felt much more available to other people who were similarly grieving. And she said that spontaneously, some of her pupils opened up about their own grief after her loss. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That people do pick up on our own experience. If we're using life experiences, whether we've been through psychotherapy formally or life is our therapy, grist for the mill, you grow and you develop, and you'll find teachers, hopefully, who can be your guide for the next stage, or your support, and hold you for the next stage of your development.
I believe in what you say. I agree with you. But pupils who are coming to the Alexander technique, see, we as Alexander teachers, see, they can't expect, we can't claim to provide, see, as a profession, what some teachers can provide. So in that sense, it's not surprising that people come to us still and look at the Alexander technique as a posture thing. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. And I think we have no more right or wrong to describe our work as postural, anatomical, or emotional and mental. I think these are sides of a spectrum. I don't think also we should be promising or offering our services as psychotherapists nor as physiotherapists. We're Alexander teachers, and we are somewhere in the spectrum. And I think it's really important that people know that they can find Alexander teachers who can be sensitive to a wider spectrum than simply anatomical postural. And I think it's okay to share that. That doesn't mean that there's no horses for courses. There are. There are. And
Thank you.
we still all have our work to do, unendingly. And there'll be some people who I'd be very wrong for because of who I am. And hopefully some people I'd be more right for. It goes for all of us. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. Next one.
All right. Next one. There was a question in the chat.
Yes.
Question for Anthony, if there is time.
Yes.
If a lesson involves communication between student and teacher, is the use of hands essential, or are other communication channels equally useful or perhaps differently useful?
Well, I would like to take this opportunity before we end to say that although I have been a very traditional Alexander teacher for, well, since 1987, I do believe there's something essential in the Alexander communication that can be communicated beyond tactile touch. Beyond tactile touch. And this has been quite a revelation for me, and we will have time, I'm sure, over the next few days to go further with this. But I moved my whole school online, and not simply for theoretical input, but for psychophysical input. And I teach, and I've been giving Alexander lessons online. And so, do I believe that something essential of the Alexander experience can be communicated without hands? The answer is most definitely yes. But it's a yes that needs exploration. It's not simply yes. It's only yes if we maintain certain essential principles, which I wanted to talk to you on the third day about. In a nutshell, I'm not the sort of Alexander teacher who wants to teach Alexander with angles and positions of necks and heads and backs. That doesn't really interest me, although I have great respect for those that want to teach like that. But the Alexander technique I'm passionate about, the Alexander technique I'm really passionate about, is the communication between teacher and pupil that happens on a much deeper psychophysical level, that goes beyond angles and positions and postures. And I do believe that that can be communicated without touch. And we can be touched in many different ways. I don't want to spoil the next few sessions, but we can be touched through voice. We can be touched through seeing a beautiful opera, through watching a beautiful ballerina. We can be touched by kind letter, email from somebody. We can be touched in many ways. We can be touched by gesture. We can be touched by a thought of something. We can be uplifted in so many ways that it's not only the Alexander teacher's hands that uplift us. If we think that, we're doomed. We're doomed. We have to learn to somehow uplift ourselves. And if we're dependent on the Alexander teacher's hands, where do we go? I love hands. I miss them dreadfully in this lockdown. But I deeply believe, very deeply believe, that we can engage with a psychophysical self and enable them to move towards more openness and poise and vitality and uplift without physical touch. I'd rather not do without it, but it's possible, it's real, and we'll talk about what the touch of an Alexander teacher is all about, hopefully in the next few days. Okay. Well, I'm sure an hour or so of Zoom is probably enough for most people. Okay, and I look forward to sharing tomorrow. If you want to send some questions, maybe really big questions, to either Jill at akprogram.com, is it, Jill? Or Ina, or even...
I'll type it in the chat now, the address. It's akprogram@outlook.com. If you want to send any questions there, then I'll make sure they're forwarded to Anthony. So I've just put that email in the email address in the chat now, and it's program with double M-E. It's that spelling of program. Okay, thank you.
And I want to just to say thank you. I found it a bit daunting that I was going to speak to you all today. And I haven't heard too many groans and grunts. So I want to thank you all for your kind faces, which is a great support, I have to say. Your kind faces and engaged faces. And somehow your presence of support was coming through and was helping me today. So thanks a lot for that. And until tomorrow, all the best.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.